5 broken cars, $100. The elegant CEO laughed loud enough for everyone in the auction yard to hear. You've just bought 5 piles of rust. The lonely single dad smiled, loaded every wreck onto an old trailer, and quietly drove away. 72 hours later, the same CEO burst into his garage with lawyers, collectors, and a blank check worth $100 million. She wasn't buying old cars anymore. She was begging, because hidden beneath decades of rust sat the only surviving prototype that could rewrite automotive history, and the quiet man she'd mocked had discovered it before anyone else. The morning of the auction started cold. A thin October frost clung to the gravel of the Riverside County Vehicle Yard, and the breath of 200 collectors, dealers, and curious onlookers rose in small clouds above their heads as they moved between the lots. Bank seizure auctions drew a particular kind of crowd, serious money mixed with opportunists, expertise mixed with ego, and always, underneath everything, the electric possibility that something of value had slipped through the cracks of someone else's misfortune. The yard was loud with the particular competitive noise of people who knew what they wanted and intended to get it. The auctioneer's amplified voice bouncing off the corrugated metal fencing, the low strategic murmurs of buyers conferring with assistants, the occasional sharp increase in a bid that drew attention the way a raised voice draws attention in a church. Jack Carter had driven 2 hours to be here. He'd left the house at 5 o'clock in the morning, skipped breakfast, and loaded his flatbed trailer before the sun came up, working in the dark by the pale overhead light of the garage with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done the same thing dozens of times. He was 40 years old, medium height, a face that didn't give much away, square jaw, calm brown eyes, the particular stillness of a man who had made peace with doing things alone. His canvas jacket was faded at the elbows and his boots had seen better years. He carried no catalog, no clipboard, no assistant. He walked the lots slowly, hands in his pockets, reading each vehicle the way other people read faces, not for what it announced about itself, but for what it tried to conceal. Jack Carter was a restoration specialist. That was the polite term. The more accurate term was that he could look at a machine and understand its history the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not just the surface but the layers beneath, the story the metal told when you knew how to listen. He understood manufacturing tolerances the way musicians understand pitch, not from a chart, but in his fingers, in the wordless intelligence of long practice. He could tell a production line vehicle from a prototype by the way a door gap felt under his thumb. He could read a weld the way a geologist reads rock strata, each layer telling a story about when and how and under what conditions something was made. He'd been doing this work for 11 years. Since the day he'd walked away from a career in engineering and rebuilt his life around the quieter, more honest work of bringing old things back to what they actually were. He lived in a small house at the edge of a town that hadn't changed much since the 1980s. His garage was larger than his house, which was a deliberate choice he'd made when he bought the property. When you have lost the thing that made the house feel full, you build toward the thing that still makes sense. He had a daughter named Maya, 16 years old, who was spending the summer with her aunt in Vermont and who sent him photographs of mountains and sometimes called on Sunday evenings when she remembered. His wife Laura had been gone for 9 years. He didn't talk about that. He didn't talk about much in general. He just worked. The morning Sirius lot sold first, a 1957 Roadster that drew a bidding war. A rare coupe from the early 1960s that went to a museum representative from the East Coast. Jack watched it all without bidding, patient and quiet at the back of the crowd. And then, near the end, the auctioneer cleared his throat and gestured toward the far fence. Lot 57, he called. 5 vehicles, non-running, sold as a group, as is no reserve. He paused, looked at the row of wrecks, looked back at the crowd. Opening bid is $100. Nobody moved, not even the opportunists. The 5 vehicles sat along the back fence like abandoned animals. A 1953 Ford with its hood collapsed inward, a long sedan with its rear window missing, and its interior dissolved to black threads, a compact coupe sitting on bare axle stubs, a truck cab with no bed attached, And the fifth, the one that had caught Jack's attention when he walked the lots an hour earlier. A vehicle so thoroughly consumed by rust that its original shape was almost entirely obscured. You couldn't identify the make. You couldn't identify the decade. All you could see was an organic mass of red-brown oxidation in the approximate shape of an automobile sitting on flat tires and collecting the morning frost like everything else in the yard that nobody wanted. Emily Harrison did not buy things she didn't want. She had not built Harrison Motors into a $4 billion enterprise by acquiring liabilities, but she had been in the automotive world long enough to develop reflexes. And one of those reflexes was a particular amusement at the sight of someone paying real money for obvious garbage. She was 38 years old, dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers. Her dark hair pulled back precisely, her expression calibrated to convey that she was always the most prepared person in any room she entered, which, most of the time, was simply accurate. She had purchased 3 vehicles that morning. She knew exactly what each one was worth. She did not make mistakes. $100, she said, pitching her voice to Carrie. Might as well move things along. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Several people near the front turned to look at her. She smiled the particular smile of someone who can afford to be generous with their amusement. Jack Carter raised his paddle. 100, he said, flat, quiet, no performance attached to it at all. Emily turned. She looked at him the way you look at someone who has misread the room. You actually want them? She said. I'm bidding, Jack said. The auctioneer recovered quickly. 100 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 110? Emily raised her paddle. Not because she wanted 5 rusted hulks, because she had a constitutionally difficult relationship with being outbid by someone who had arrived in a 1992 pickup truck with a flatbed trailer attached. 110, she said. 120, Jack said. It went back and forth 4 more times before Emily, with the air of someone releasing a fish too small to keep, lowered her paddle and looked away. Jack won the lot at $140. The crowd laughed not viciously, but with the particular amusement of people watching something slightly absurd play out. Emily looked at him one more time. Congratulations, she said, loud enough for the nearest 30 people to hear. You just bought 5 junkyards. I hope the tetanus is complimentary. More laughter. Genuine laughter. The kind that settles into an anecdote people repeat over drinks later. Jack did not respond. He tucked his paddle under his arm, walked to the payment table, and signed the paperwork with the same calm expression he'd arrived with. He spent 90 minutes loading the 5 vehicles onto his trailer, working alone, using chains and a hand winch with the methodical efficiency of someone who has done this many times. Nobody helped. Nobody offered. A few people watched from a distance with the faintly puzzled expression of spectators at a magic trick they couldn't figure out, waiting for the joke to resolve into an explanation. For the punchline to arrive. It didn't arrive. Jack simply worked, vehicle by vehicle, chain by chain, until all 5 were secured and the trailer sat level and true behind his truck. He checked the chains twice. He checked the loading lights. He walked the full length of the trailer and came back to the cab. By the time he pulled out through the gravel exit, the crowd had dispersed entirely and the auction yard was already resetting for the afternoon session. Emily Harrison's town car was gone. The laughter was gone and Jack Carter was on the highway heading home, both hands on the wheel, radio off, thinking about the 5th vehicle. He did not go home directly. He stopped at a gas station and bought a large coffee and sat in the cab of his truck for 20 minutes staring at nothing in particular, running through what he'd observed when he walked the lots that morning. The 5th vehicle, the rust, the proportions underneath the rust, because rust, no matter how thorough, cannot entirely erase proportion. The wheel arch radius that was wrong for any production vehicle he could immediately name. The door gap geometry that spoke of manufacturing tolerances tighter than anything that came off an assembly line in that era. He'd walked past it twice. The second time, he'd crouched and looked at the undercarriage for 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. That was enough. He started the truck and drove home. He unloaded the vehicles over 2 evenings, arranging them in his garage in the order he intended to examine them. He was not hurrying. He was not operating on excitement. He was doing what he always did, reading. The first car, the Ford, gave him nothing unusual. Solid history, production stampings clean and consistent, worth restoring for the pleasure of it. The long sedan yielded a mildly interesting dashboard assembly, but nothing that changed any calculation. The coupe was stripped bare. Someone had harvested the useful parts decades ago, leaving a shell. The truck cab had a cracked frame. That explained the bank's decision to write it off entirely. He set all 4 aside and pulled the 5th vehicle under the center light. He turned on every lamp in the garage. He pulled up a stool and he began. He started with the exterior body. He ran his palms slowly along every surface, feeling through the rust for the geometry underneath. The body seams were not where they should be for any vehicle in his mental catalog. The curvature of the roofline was subtly, persistently wrong for anything commercially produced. He photographed every surface. He noted the locations of every weld point he could find, sketching a rough diagram on graph paper as he went. After 2 hours, he removed a rear quarter panel, a careful operation requiring patience and a heat gun, and 2 specialty tools he'd made himself and found beneath the rust on the inside face. A small stamped oval, a prototype shop mark, not a production facility, a prototype shop. He sat very still for a while. He found the Milldown logo an hour later beneath a section of trim that had been deliberately disguised with body filler sometime in the distant past. Someone had worked hard to make this vehicle look like something it wasn't. The logo was reduced to a ghost in the metal, a raised impression, barely a millimeter high, visible only under raking light at a precise angle, but Jack had spent 15 years in proximity to that particular mark. He knew its proportions. He knew the specific serif on the capital letter. He pressed his thumb against it and held it there for a long moment, feeling the edge, making absolutely certain. Then he stood up, covered the vehicle with a canvas tarp, locked every lock on the garage, went inside, made coffee, did not sleep. By 2 o'clock in the morning, he had made 14 phone calls. He had spoken to a retired metallurgist named Dennis who lived in Ohio and had spent 4 decades examining automotive materials for courts and insurance companies. He had reached a document archivist named Helen at a university museum who had helped him authenticate a find 3 years ago and owed him in the informal ledger of professional favors something significant. He had spoken to 2 automotive historians under conditions of strict confidentiality, asking oblique questions designed to gather information without revealing what he already suspected. He had not told any of them what he had found. He had only asked what they knew, and what they knew assembled piece by piece through those long dark hours, assembled into a picture that made his hands go very still on the kitchen table. He made one final note on the graph paper, circled it, set the pencil down. Then he went to bed and slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a man who has confirmed something important and knows exactly what to do next. He knew what it would mean. If the vehicle was what he believed it was not merely valuable. It was the most significant find in American automotive history in the past 50 years. The prototype had been publicly reported as destroyed in a factory fire in 1963, a fire the company had attributed to an electrical fault, a fire that had been, in the official narrative, a tragic accident that eliminated an experimental program the board had already decided to cancel. The prototype's existence had been debated at conferences for decades. The way certain historical mysteries get debated with genuine scholarly interest, but without real expectation of resolution. Nobody seriously believed it had survived. Nobody with resources had looked for it seriously in 20 years. And now it was sitting under a canvas tarp in Jack Carter's garage, having arrived there via a bank auction, a flatbed trailer, and $140. He kept it quiet for 3 weeks. He worked on the other 4 vehicles in the daylight hours, making visible progress on the Ford's bodywork, so that any neighbor glancing over would see nothing unusual, just a restoration specialist doing restoration work. He kept his expression neutral when he picked up coffee at the diner down the road and the owner asked what he was working on. "Old stock," he said. "Bank auction stuff. Nothing interesting." At night, alone, under the center light with the garage doors closed and latched, he worked on the fifth. He removed the dashboard with the care of a surgeon. Each fastener catalogued by position. Each wire harness photographed before it was disconnected. Each bracket set aside in labeled trays. Took 4 evenings. On the 5th evening, with the dashboard fully clear, he saw the cavity. It should not have been there. In any production vehicle of that era, the space behind the dashboard was occupied entirely by structure and mechanism. This space was deliberate, built-in, framed in steel, designed to exist. He photographed it from 3 angles before he reached inside. His fingers found the aluminum cap first, threaded, tight, resistant. It had been closed by someone with intent, not by accident. He used a strap wrench. It took 6 minutes of careful pressure. The cap came free. Inside the tube, wrapped in oil-treated canvas that had kept the moisture out for more than 50 years, were engineering drawings, precise, extraordinary, the kind of draftsmanship that belonged to an era before computers made accuracy a software function rather than a human one. The lines were clean and definitive. The tolerances were noted to the 1,000th of an inch. Below the drawings, specification sheets covered in a handwriting he did not yet recognize, small, dense, certain. Then test track records, page after page of performance data in careful tabular form, with notes in the margins in 2 different hands, as if 2 engineers had been looking at the same data and reaching different conclusions that they then argued out in the margins. And finally, at the bottom of the tube, wrapped separately in a piece of flannel cloth, a photograph. 5 men standing in front of the vehicle as it had looked when it was new, when nobody had yet hidden it, when it was simply what it was, clean lines, honest proportions, an object of genuine and uncontrived beauty. Jack looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he turned it over. In pencil, in handwriting that matched the specification sheets, a date in the spring of 1960. 2. And a project code. He read the project code. Read it again. Set the photograph face down on the workbench. Sat down on the concrete floor of the garage and stayed there for a long time. Not thinking, just letting the weight of it settle. News moves in specialized worlds the way water moves through limestone, not on the surface, invisibly, through channels only the terrain knows. Within 10 days of the auction, the collector community had noticed that Jack Carter had bought Lot 57. Within another week, someone who knew Dennis had mentioned that Dennis had been asked unusual questions about material dating. The shape of the rumor was imprecise, but its direction was clear. Something had come out of that auction that wasn't garbage. Emily Harrison's intelligence network inside the collector world was, like everything she maintained, thorough and well-resourced. Her assistant compiled the first report within 3 days of the auction. The second report, the one that arrived 2 weeks later, was more specific. Emily read it at her desk at 7 o'clock in the morning and set it down and looked out the window for a long time. She went to the garage herself that Thursday. She drove alone, which was unusual, and she wore less formal clothes than she'd worn at the auction. Though less formal for Emily still meant precision. She knocked on the garage door. Jack came out to meet her, a shop rag in one hand. He did not seem surprised to see her. She did not waste time on pleasantries. "I want to buy the 5 cars," she said. "All of them. $5,000. That's a 35-fold return in 2 weeks. "Not selling," he said. "50,000. He didn't change expression. "No." She studied him carefully. He was not nervous. He was not calculating. He was simply present, standing in his driveway in a canvas jacket, looking at her with the patient calm of someone who has already thought through this conversation and knows how it ends. "What do you think you have?" she asked. 5 old cars, he said. It was not a lie. It was simply not the whole truth. And Emily Harrison, who made her living reading situations and people, could not find the seam between the two. She left frustrated. She increased the offer to $100,000 by phone that evening. He declined politely and thanked her for calling. She drove home and spent the evening with her chief legal counsel going over the corporate genealogy of 3 predecessor companies. She was beginning to understand that she might have made a very expensive joke at that auction. What Emily's investigators could not find, because it was not in any file they had access to, was the specific story of why Jack Carter had left the engineering world 12 years ago. It was not a dramatic story in the way that dramatic stories announce themselves. It was the kind of story that happens quietly in rooms that are sealed, in documents that get filed incorrectly or lost or simply never created. Jack had been a senior engineer at a vehicle manufacturer, a real one, not a boutique shop, a company with production lines and quarterly earnings calls and a legal department that employed more people than some small towns. He had been, by every account of people who worked alongside him, genuinely gifted, the kind of engineer that companies build institutional strategy around. He had been offered promotions. He had been offered corner offices. He had been told, in the indirect language that corporations use for compliments, that he was indispensable. And then, in the spring of the year, Maya turned 4, and Laura was 18 months into the illness that would eventually take her. Jack had been handed a set of safety analysis documents and asked to sign off on them. He read them over 3 evenings at the kitchen table after Maya was in bed and Laura was asleep, the house quiet, the numbers precise under the lamp. He ran his own analysis, which took another week, and he concluded with the methodical certainty that was the only mode of thought he actually trusted, the same certainty that had made him valuable to the company in the first place, that the documents were wrong, not by accident, by design. Someone had shaped the data the way you shape a statement you intend to be technically defensible, true in its individual components, false in its assembled conclusion. The vehicles in question had a suspension failure mode that would, under specific conditions involving wet pavement and highway speed and a particular sequence of steering inputs, become dangerous in a way that was not marginal and not theoretical. He demonstrated it himself in his own analysis. He demonstrated it 3 separate times to make certain he had not made an error. He had not made an error. He wrote a formal report of 47 pages. He submitted it through proper channels with a cover memo that was factual and direct and devoid of accusation because he understood that accusation would give people something to argue about rather than the data itself. He was told by his direct supervisor and then by the supervisor above that he had misread the data. He was offered a raise. He was invited to lunch by an executive he had never previously met socially who spent the meal describing, in warm and admiring terms, what Jack's career could look like over the next decade if he continued to demonstrate the kind of collaborative judgment the company valued. He went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table again and thought about Laura's medical costs, and Maya's eventual college and the mortgage on the house. And he sat there for a long time. Then he stood up, went to his desk, and wrote his resignation. He submitted it the next morning. He spent 8 months trying to bring the report to regulatory channels, during which time the company's legal team was prepared and thorough and entirely accustomed to being patient. He was a single engineer with a sick wife and a 4-year-old and a legal fund that lasted 8 months before it was gone. The vehicles were never recalled. Nobody was ever held to account. He had spent years living with that afterward, not loudly, not with visible bitterness, but with the specific permanent weight of a person who did the right thing and watched the right thing lose, and who had decided, somewhere in the long quiet aftermath, that the only thing he could still control was whether he himself continued to tell the truth about what he saw. That was the man who had bought 5 broken cars for $140. That was the man who sat across the kitchen table from Emily Harrison when she came with a lawyer and offered $1 million, and then $5 million, and then $20 million, and watched his expression not change. The lawyer beside Emily was a tall man named Robert, who had 20 years of experience persuading people to sign things, and he contributed his own points in his own turn about market volatility, about legal complications, about the wisdom of resolving uncertain situations cleanly and quickly. Jack listened to all of it. He did not appear to find any of it interesting. Emily watched him across the table and felt something she had not felt in a professional context in a long time. She could not read the situation. The man was not bluffing. He was not performing reluctance in order to drive a price. He was sitting in his dead wife's kitchen in a house with one stoplight outside it, being offered $20 million. And he appeared to be genuinely unmoved. Not because he was stupid, because he had decided something a long time ago that made the money beside the point. "I don't sell things I don't fully understand yet," he said when she reached 20 million. "I'm not finished with what I have." She looked at him across the table. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not have a next move prepared. She felt something she could not immediately categorize. Not exactly admiration, not exactly frustration. Something that had the texture of recognition, as if she were looking at a version of integrity she had known about theoretically and was now encountering in practice for the first time. "That kind of stubbornness is expensive," she said. "I know," he said. "I've paid for it before." He stood. He thanked them both for coming. He walked them to the door. The legal machinery arrived the following week. A letter from attorneys representing a corporate heritage trust and entity, Patricia Reeves explained when Jack brought it to her office, constructed specifically to assert intellectual property claims on behalf of successor corporations connected to the original manufacturer. The letter was precisely worded and entirely aggressive beneath its polite surface. It claimed the prototype as corporate property regardless of its chain of physical custody. It requested immediate cessation of authentication activities. It demanded the vehicle be made available for inspection by trust representatives within 14 days. Patricia read it, set it down, looked at Jack over the top of her glasses and said, "They want what you have. That means what you have is real." She paused. "Let me write back." 2 investment funds contacted Jack directly that same week, having obtained his number through channels he did not trace. One wanted the intellectual property of the technical documents. The other had a museum acquisition division and was prepared, their representative said on the phone, to be very generous. Jack thanked them both and said he'd be in touch. He called Patricia and told her about the calls. She told him to stop answering numbers he didn't recognize. He agreed and then answered one more because it was Emily Harrison calling from her personal cell, not her assistant's line, which meant she was calling as herself rather than as the CEO of Harrison Motors. "There are people moving on this," she said. "Serious people with serious resources. The Heritage Trust alone has retained 4 firms. If they get to a judge before authentication is complete, they can tie this up in injunctions for 2 years minimum." A pause. "I can help. Harrison Motors has the historical documentation to challenge the trust's chain of corporate succession. There are gaps in it. Real gaps that their attorneys would prefer nobody look at closely. I can put our legal team into this." Another pause. "The longer kind. I'm not offering this free, but I'm also not offering it for money. I'm offering it because that vehicle deserves to be in a museum, not in a corporate vault." And because she stopped because Jack said because what I said at the auction was wrong. The words came out even, but he could hear the effort in them. "I looked at you and I made a decision about what you were. And I was wrong. I'd like the chance to do something about that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come to the garage," he said. I to show you something." She arrived the next morning at 8 o'clock and Jack had been in the garage since 6 o'clock. He had removed the tarp from the vehicle entirely and repositioned every lamp and work light he owned to illuminate it from multiple angles, eliminating shadows, so that the lines were as visible as they could be made. He had also, sometime in the early morning, wire brushed the worst of the surface oxidation from the major structural and design elements. Not restoration, not cleanup, just enough to let the vehicle's original geometry speak for itself. Emily Harrison walked through the garage door and stopped. She stood in the entrance for a long moment without speaking, and her expression did something that Jack had not seen it do in any of their previous encounters. It simply opened, not into vulnerability exactly, into attention, pure, undivided, professional attention directed at something genuinely unexpected. She walked forward slowly with the careful, unhurried movement of someone who wants to understand something before they react to it. She moved along the driver's side, then around the front. She stopped at the passenger quarter. She leaned slightly and studied the line where the door met the pillar. Then she straightened and stood at the front of the vehicle, looking at it full on, and she ran one finger along the roofline without touching the metal, tracing the curve in the air an inch above the surface. "The proportions," she said quietly. "Yes," Jack said. "I've seen photographs in published papers, academic journals." She moved to the front of the vehicle, still not touching. "I always assumed they were design study models, fiberglass mock-ups." "Not," she stopped. "Not this." "It ran," Jack said. 46 hours of documented test track time. The records are in the tube." He paused. The chief engineer wrote in his notes that it was the finest vehicle he had ever worked on. He was not, from everything I can determine, a man who exaggerated. She stood at the front of the vehicle and looked at it for a long time. The expression on her face had changed into something Jack hadn't seen there before, something stripped of the professional composure that was usually its entire surface, something that looked, beneath the precision and the certainty and the years of being right about things, a little like grief. "Why did they bury it?" she asked. "Capital investment the board didn't want to make," Jack said. And the chief engineer had started asking questions about the fire, the official explanation. He'd found inconsistencies. He was the kind of man who found inconsistencies difficult to leave alone. He looked at the vehicle. He didn't get the chance to finish asking. Emily turned to look at him. "You understand what that's like," she said. "I understand what that's like," he said. They stood together in the garage for a while after that, not talking. The vehicle stood between them and they both looked at it. And for the first time since the auction, there was nothing adversarial in the air, just two people who had arrived, by very different routes, at the same understanding of what they were looking at. Emily left an hour later. She drove directly from Jack's garage to her company's legal department and spent 3 hours going through the Heritage Trust's corporate succession documents with her general counsel and 2 outside specialists she had placed on retainer that morning. The gaps in the chain were real and significant, not ambiguous technicalities, but substantive breaks in the documentary record that revealed the trust's claim to be built on an assumption of continuous corporate identity that the actual paperwork did not support. Her general counsel, a careful woman who did not use the word solid lightly, used the word solid. The Heritage Trust's attorneys, when contacted, asked for time to review. They took 10 days. On the 11th day, with the scheduled hearing 1 day away, they withdrew the challenge. No statement was issued. No explanation was given. The withdrawal was quiet, the way retreats are quiet, fast, and without ceremony. Patricia Reeves called Jack to tell him. He said, "Thank you," and asked if she needed anything else that day. She said, "No." He went back to the garage. The authentication panel convened in late October. 3 independent automotive historians, 2 material scientists, 1 document archivist from a major institution. They worked for 6 days. They issued their conclusion unanimously. The vehicle was genuine. The documentation was genuine. The provenance, despite the unusual route hidden inside a derelict fleet vehicle, passed through a bank seizure, sold at auction for $140, was legally unambiguous. Jack Carter owned it outright. The insurance valuation came in at $112 million, a number that reflected not just the vehicle itself, but the complete documentary record, the engineering drawings, the test data, the handwritten notes of a chief engineer whose contributions had been systematically minimized for half a century and could no longer be. The public authentication announcement broke across the automotive press like a wave and kept going. Within 3 days, it had reached general news, and within a week, it had reached the kind of international coverage that makes phones ring constantly and Patricia Reeves earn every dollar of her fee. A Swiss collector's letter arrived on heavy cream paper. 2 television production companies called. An engineering school in the Midwest issued a formal statement calling the discovery the most significant preservation event in American automotive history in living memory. Jack read all of it, filed it carefully, and went back to the garage. Emily Harrison held a press conference the morning after authentication was confirmed. She stood at a podium in front of Harrison Motors' corporate communications team, who had prepared remarks for her that she read once, set aside, and did not use. And she said something that nobody in that room had expected her to say. She said that the discovery of the prototype was a moment that required honesty from her company about its history, not the curated version, not the version that mentioned the achievements and omitted the rest, but the actual history, including the decisions that had been made in the 1960s to suppress an engineering direction because it was inconvenient, and the questions a chief engineer had asked about a fire. And what had become of those questions? She said that the decisions made by predecessor companies whose assets Harrison Motors had absorbed through a long chain of restructurings were not decisions she could defend, only acknowledge. She said the museum would tell the complete story, and that telling it completely was more important to her than the discomfort it might cause to anyone, including herself and her company. And then she looked directly at the nearest camera and said, "The only person in that auction yard who looked at 5 cars everybody else had already dismissed and saw what they actually were is a man I laughed at in front of 200 people. That was wrong. I want to say it clearly, on record, because the clarity matters more than my comfort." Her communications team was very quiet afterward. The automotive press ran the statement verbatim. Several of them ran it twice. A reporter who covered automotive industry for a national publication wrote that it was the most honest thing a CEO had said in public in her 10 years on the beat. She drove to Jack's garage the following morning. Alone, plain folder under her arm. She set it on the workbench beside the vehicle, which was now fully uncovered, fully documented, and waiting. $100 million, she said. No conditions, no negotiation, no time limit on the offer. He picked up the folder. "Read through it slowly. What do you intend to do with it?" he said. "The vehicle. If I sell." She had been thinking about this for weeks, and it showed the particular focus of a person who has worked through every dimension of a problem and arrived at genuine conviction. "Harrison Motors owns a property in Michigan," she said. "A factory building from the late 1930s, solid construction. We've been trying to determine its right use for 3 years. We convert it into a museum, a real institution with independent academic oversight, not a corporate promotional tool. The vehicle is the centerpiece. The documents are available to researchers under archival conditions. The full history is told, all of it, including the fire, including the suppression, including the chief engineer's questions and what happened to them. The Harrison Heritage Museum." She paused. "Your name is on the founding documentation as the person who found and authenticated this vehicle. That is not a negotiating point. That is a condition." "Why non-negotiable?" he said. "Because it's true," she said. "Because without you, this vehicle gets crushed or it sits in a crate, and the documents stay sealed for another 50 years. Because the accurate story is the only story worth telling." She met his eyes, and because I made a mistake in front of a lot of people, and the only way to correct it properly is to make sure the public version of this story is complete and correct. He looked at the vehicle for a long time. Then he looked back at her. "One condition from my side," he said. "My daughter Maya gets a seat on the museum's advisory board. She's 16. She'll be older when the museum opens. I want her involved from the beginning. She should understand what this is and why it matters." Emily Harrison, who had built a $4 billion company and sat across the table from people who tried to renegotiate at the last minute on a weekly basis, looked at him for a moment. Then, "Done," she said. "Absolutely and without question. Done." He picked up the pen. He signed. The Harrison Heritage Museum opened on a Saturday in early March, 14 months after a bank auction in a frost-covered yard, where 5 cars sat along a fence, and everyone with money and expertise had already walked away. The Michigan building had been transformed with the same careful attention Jack brought to restoration. Nothing disguised, nothing falsified. The original bones of the 1930s construction preserved and opened up, stripped of its decades of industrial accumulation, and filled with natural light from skylights that had been installed along the roofline, where the old ventilation shafts had been. The floors were the original concrete, ground smooth and sealed. The walls were bare brick. The ceiling was open to the timber trusses. It looked like what it was, an honest building that had worked hard for a long time, now given a new purpose that respected what it had been. The main gallery occupied the center of the building, its ceiling the highest point, its floor uncluttered. The prototype occupied the center of that space under a warm cone of focused light, raised on a low platform of dark steel that kept it accessible to the eye without making it untouchable. It had been fully restored to running condition, not the artificial perfection of a show vehicle that only ever existed to be admired, but the working mechanical condition it had been in on the day of its 46th hour of test track time, when the chief engineer had written in his log that everything was performing beyond expectation. Around it, the technical documents were displayed in archival cases built flush into the surrounding walls. The engineering drawings, the test records page by page, the original performance logs with their marginal notes in two different hands, the photograph of the 5 men matted and framed and lit with the same care as everything else. And beside the photograph, printed in plain letters on the wall itself, the date and the project code and a paragraph explaining what both meant for the history of the industry. All of it exactly as found, exactly as it was, nothing added, nothing removed. The opening ceremony brought international coverage. Collectors and engineers and historians and museum directors and ordinary people who had read an article somewhere and decided the drive was worth it. Emily spoke first, briefly. She said the museum was an attempt to be honest about a complicated history, and that honesty was, in her experience, harder than almost any other business decision, but ultimately the only one that compounds. She said that the vehicle behind her had survived because one person paid attention when everyone else had already made up their minds. She said no more than that. She let it stand. When Jack stepped to the podium, Maya was in the front row. 17 now, watching her father with an expression that had in it both pride and the particular quality of recognition that teenagers feel when they discover their parents are more than they appeared to be. He looked at her for a moment, then at the room, then at the vehicle, lit and visible and no longer hidden from anything. Value gets covered up, he said. In rust, in time, in the noise of people who decided before they looked. He paused. The car was always what it was. It didn't need anyone to confirm it. It just needed someone willing to look past the surface. He stepped back. The room held its quiet for a beat, the particular silence of something simply and truly said, and then the applause came. The 5 restored vehicles stood along the east wall of the secondary gallery, each accompanied by its own card, its own history, its own trajectory from Lot 57 to this lit and permanent place. Visitors moved between them through the morning. Children pressed their faces to the archival glass. An engineering professor from a Midwestern university stood in front of the technical drawings for nearly an hour, making notes. A journalist photographed the founding plaque 3 times from different angles until she had the shot she wanted. Jack stood in the doorway of the main gallery late in the morning, watching the room. Emily came to stand beside him. The formal obligations of the day had largely been discharged. The cameras were elsewhere. The speeches were over. It was just 2 people standing in the entrance to something they had built, looking at what it had become. Strange, she said. Not to him exactly, just aloud to the room, that it took all of that to get here. $140. It's always like that, he said. The things that matter most arrive without announcements. She turned to look at him. He was watching the vehicle with the same attention he'd had at the auction. The same focused, unhurried calm she'd initially misread as vacancy. It was not vacancy. It was the opposite of vacancy. It was what a person looks like when they have decided at considerable personal cost to see things as they actually are. I'm glad you were there that morning, she said. At the auction. So am I, he said. And then, a moment later, I was glad you were there, too. She looked at him. I was terrible. You were, he agreed. And something moved at the corner of his mouth that was nearly a smile. But you came back and you changed what you were going to do. That's harder than being right the first time. Outside, through the tall windows of the museum, the Michigan sky was the clear, pale blue of early March, and the parking lot was full. And somewhere in the gallery behind them, Maya Carter was explaining the engineering drawings to a group of high school students who had arrived on a bus, her voice carrying clear and confident and interested across the space. The voice of someone who has already decided that understanding how things actually work is the most important skill a person can have. Jack heard it, and something settled quietly in his face, something private and complete. The 5 vehicles stood in their light. The documents rested behind archival glass. The history, the full history, the uncomfortable and the admirable and the suppressed and the rediscovered was displayed on the walls for anyone willing to read it. The doors were open. More visitors were arriving. A family with young children, a retired engineer in a good coat, a college student with a notebook, a woman who had driven 4 hours because she'd read about the chief engineer and wanted to see his handwriting in person. They all came in. They all looked. That was the point. That was, in the end, the whole of it. Jack Carter had paid $140 for 5 broken cars. He had looked when no one else was looking. He had waited with a patience that came from having once refused something far more costly and lived with the consequences for a decade. And he had refused to be rushed by numbers or embarrassed by laughter. He had refused when it would have been very easy and very lucrative to sign his name to something false. And he had carried the weight of that refusal for years in a small house in a town that didn't change much, rebuilding old machines and raising a daughter and living quietly inside the integrity he had chosen. What he had found beneath the rust was not just a vehicle, though it was that, too, a vehicle of genuine historical importance, the work of real hands and real intelligence, built to do something remarkable and then deliberately hidden because the remarkable was inconvenient. It was evidence that something real had existed, that it had mattered, that the people who built it and the ideas they had given their professional lives to were worth preserving regardless of what had been done over decades to ensure they were forgotten. He had found it because he looked, because he had trained himself over years of quiet and loss and careful solitary work that nobody applauded and nobody photographed to see past the surface of things to what they actually were, to look at rust and see the vehicle underneath, to look at a man in a canvas jacket and understand that the jacket was not the man, to hold the truth steady when the room was laughing. The rust had been cleaned away. The light was on. The doors of the Harrison Heritage Museum were open to anyone who walked through them. And what was inside was not a trophy or a monument to money or a corporation's attempt to own its own history. It was a room full of truth, the careful, documented, irreducible truth of what had been built and what had been buried and how long it had waited and who had finally seen it for what it was. A vehicle in a cone of warm light, a man's name on a wall, a photograph of 5 engineers who had done their best work and been forgotten. Remembered now, permanently, by the institution that had once been connected to their forgetting. Inside, in the center of a room built to last, a vehicle that had been dismissed and laughed at and passed over sat in its rightful place, exactly as real as it had always been, worth everything, always had been, always would be.